Greetings, humans of the internet. Welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you as usual from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA with some more historical insight. I'm sure that most of you out there, when driving, though that is, those of you who can drive, because I know that very often children will listen to this podcast, and I say hello to you. I think my niece Lachlan may be watching this. Hi, Lachlan. Give my love to your mother and my other niece Larkin. But anyway, I digress. I'm sure that most of you out there who drive have probably used windshield wipers at one point in your life. And if not, you probably have a very dirty windshield. I'm sure that most of you have probably never once thought about the person who invented the windshield wiper. And well, that is the subject of today's episode, Forgotten Inventors. Because I think it's time that we now shed some light and give reverence and respect to these great men and women. So please join me as we dive into this subject. Now, I'm sure that some of you, or most of you out there, in fact, I'm pretty sure most of you at one time of your lives have used a can opener to open a can of food. Well, believe it or not, the first can opener wasn't invented until almost 50 years after the invention of the metal can, and even then by a man whose name is largely forgotten in the channels of history. Now, for the history of canned food, we have to travel back to the year 1810. That is when a British merchant named Peter Durand was granted a patent for the tin can in 1810. And before the invention, preservation was a major challenge for the food industry, as food could only be stored for short periods of time and limited amounts. But they were something of a niche item. They were produced at a rate of about 6 per hour and rising to 60 per hour only in the 1840s. And as they began to penetrate the market, can openers finally began to look like a good idea. However, these early tin cans were too thick to be opened in such a fashion. They were made of wrought iron, which is the same material from which fences are made, and lined with tin. And they could be as thick as 3/16 of an inch. And a hammer and chisel was not just the informal method of opening these cans, it was the manufacturer's suggested method. And now for the can opener, we have to fast forward over, well, actually almost 40 years to 1858. Actually, correction, over 40 years. Again, another correction, over 40 years to 1858. And it was then that a man named Ezra J. Warner was granted a patent for a can opener on January 5th. And during that time, can linings became thinner and were made of steel rather than wrought iron. And these early can openers were definitely something to see. They were very intimidating looking devices that looked like a cross between a sickle and a bayonet. And they were also very difficult to use. And they left jagged edges along the edge of the top of the can. But they were nonetheless, they were eagerly adopted by the U.S. Army during the Civil War, because, as you can imagine, it would probably be pretty handy to have canned foods on the front and then have something with which to open them. However, household use of the can opener would not really take hold until 1870. That's when another man, whose name is sadly forgotten in the annals of time, invented another can opener with a revolving wheel. The man's name was William Lyman, and his 1870 rotating wheel can opener was a game changer to say the least. His design made opening cans much easier, though it still needed some tweaks. However, he did not live to see his creation become a kitchen essential. But operating this early can opener was not exactly simple. You had to adjust the length to fit the can by twisting a wing nut. And now something for the farmers out there. Now, as many people know, barbed wire played a crucial role during the westward expansion period in American history, and because it made it possible to fence in vast tracts of land that were previously open and vulnerable, making it easier for ranchers to control their herds and farmers to protect their crops. It also contributed to the end of the open range system and the emergence of large-scale agriculture across the country, as it was now much easier to enforce property rights on the ground. And for barbed wire, we have to thank a man named Joseph Gilden. In 1874, he patented the first practical design for barbed wire. The invention dramatically reduced the costs of separating cattle and crops, and thus the cost of enforcing property rights on land. Now, prior to barbed wire, wood had been the fencing material of choice in America. However, as settlers began moving into western Minnesota, Texas, Kansas, Nebraska, and even farther west, they found a lack of trees plus high transport costs, which made fencing prohibitively expensive across wide areas. And as a practical matter, it was not economically viable to settle in an area unless it happened to have a local timber plot. And so, plain farmers had secure property rights to physical land because they could not protect their crops from cattle and other livestock. Property rights and the economic value of their lands were sharply weakened, and as early as the 1840s, the lack of timber throughout the plains was recognized as the single most important barrier to settlement. And Glidden's invention eliminated that barrier entirely and quickly changed the settlement calculus. The barbs on the wire prevented cattle from breaking the fence, and the steel wire was relatively weather resistant, and Glidden's design was cheap to manufacture, and compared to wood, it had lower labor requirements for installation and repair. And within short order, barbed wire became the dominant fencing material, and transformed the economic decisions of settlers. And in 1874, 5 tons of barbed wire were produced, and by 1880, 40,000 tons were manufactured. And by the turn of the century, annual production had reached 200,000 tons. That's a lot of wire. As barbed wire became a common sight on farms and ranches throughout the American West, Glidden became one of the most successful inventors and businessmen in American history, even though today he is relatively forgotten. Now, I think it is a good time to discuss 2 African American inventors whose names have sadly been lost in the annals of time. However, one man's name still lives on in a well-known saying. Did you know we have the same man to thank for both the gas mask and traffic signals? That man is none other than Garrett A. Morgan. He was born on March 4th, 1877 in Paris, Kentucky, and he was credited with important inventions in public safety. He invented the gas mask and the traffic signal, 2 inventions that have saved countless lives over the years. He patented the gas mask in 1914 and has since been used by firefighters, police officers, and other first responders to protect them from the effects of smoke and gas during accidents and other similar situations. The original design featured a hood that covered the wearer's head along with a breathing tube that filtered out harmful chemicals and smoke. And along with this, he also patented the 3-position traffic signal in 1923. Mr. Morgan found the inspiration to develop the gas mask when he learned about the devastating Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire that caused the death of 146 garment workers in New York City in 1911. And understanding that the firefighters had trouble with smoke inhalation, he began to develop a solution. And in 1912, he filed for a patent on his breathing device, which he called a safety hood, that was designed to give a first responder the ability to, and I quote, supply himself at will with fresh air from near the floor and at the same time forcibly remove smoke or injurious gases from the air tube. And 2 years later, he established the National Safety Device Company. And by 1916, the importance of Morgan's safety hood invention was demonstrated at the site of a tragic accident in Cleveland, Ohio. And following the explosion at the Cleveland Water Works, which killed 18 workers, survivors were trapped as a gas-filled tunnel collapsed under Lake Erie. Without effective safety equipment, the rescuers had been unable to reach them because smoke, dust, and fumes blocked their way. But when some volunteers, including Morgan himself, wore safety hoods, they were able to successfully reach and rescue several survivors. However, despite his invention's obvious life-saving potential, Morgan found difficulty in selling his safety hood to white fire chiefs who refused to buy products from a black inventor. And in response, Morgan sought the advice of the famous entrepreneur J.P. Morgan, who suggested he remove his name from the product. Sadly, following this advice, the inventor began calling his device the Morgan Safety Hood. He also hired white actors to promote the product at conventions, helping him to avoid racist objection. I know, folks, it's stupid, but now I am honoring Mr. Morgan. By the 1920s, he had established himself as a successful businessman and had purchased an automobile. While driving through Cleveland one day, he witnessed a collision between a horse-drawn carriage and another vehicle at an intersection, and this compelled him to once again use his talent and skills to develop an invention that would improve the safety and welfare of his fellow citizens. And though rudimentary traffic lights had existed at the time, they only displayed 2 signals, stop and go. He recognized the need for a better traffic control on congested city streets, and he created a revolutionary T-shaped signal that included a caution light, which is the equivalent of a yellow light today. He patented his 3-way traffic signal in 1923. According to his patent, his hand-operated signal stopped traffic in all directions before the signal to proceed in any one direction is given. And this allowed vehicles that were already in an intersection to safely pass through it without the risk of a collision. And he sold the patent rights for $40,000 to General Electric, and the company developed an electric version of his 3-way traffic signal. And I'm sure that most of you out there at one point in your lives have heard the expression the real McCoy. But have any of you ever wondered from where that may ever or from whom that may have originated? Well, wonder no more. We have a man named Elijah McCoy to thank for that expression. He was an African American inventor who created an automatic lubricator for steam engines, and this made the industrial machine work better. However, his work is not as well known as others from the Industrial Revolution, but his name lives on in the iconic saying, "The real McCoy." And it now brings us to my opener, and that, of course, is the windshield wiper. And for that, we have to look to 1903. It was then that a woman named Mary Anderson was granted a patent for a windshield wiper. She came up with the idea in 1902 after she observed that drivers at the time had to stop their cars and manually clear snow, rain, and other debris from the windshields to improve visibility, which was dangerous and time-consuming. Her earliest prototype comprised a lever that could be used to move a rubber blade across the windshield from inside the car. She patented, as I said, in 1903, though it would take some more years before drivers warmed up to the idea. Many car manufacturers were skeptical of the need of such a thing in cars at the time, and they were slow to adapt to the technology. Obviously, they were wrong about it, because windshield wipers are a standard feature in almost every car sold around the world today. And since her invention, she has been awarded a number of honors and awards for her contribution to automobile safety, including her 2011 induction into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. And to those of you who are corn eaters, we also have an African American to thank for the corn planter, a man named Henry Blair, credited with the invention of the corn planter in 1836. And while we are not exactly sure about his exact origins, he is assumed to have been a freedman around the time of the invention because slaves were not allowed to file patents back then. And his corn planter was a significant improvement over previous methods of planting corn, which usually involved time-consuming work like digging holes and planting seeds by hand. His device was a horse-drawn machine that could plant corn seeds in a straight row on a large scale, greatly increasing efficiency and speed. And his invention made it possible for farmers to plant corn quickly and effectively and relatively effortlessly, which led to increased productivity and lower food prices. And the corn planter also paved the way for the large mechanization of agriculture, which played an important role in the development of industry across America. So thank you, Henry Blair. And folks, I'm sorry, but it looks like it's time to say goodbye again. However, before leaving, I would like to remind you to all follow the Bowtie Talks page and check out the Bowtie Talks Facebook and Instagram pages as well. Be sure to like and follow those, of course. And I would also like to thank the people at top10s.net, history.co.uk, vocal.media, americasgreatestmakers.com, smithsonianmag.com, and pbs.org for the information I used to make this episode. Thank you, goodbye, and God bless.